Hey, it's Bill Simmons from the Bill Simmons Podcast here to tell you about Michelob Ultra Courtside. It's getting fans closer to the NBA with a chance to win prizes like courtside seats, a trip to All-Star Weekend, and much more. Check it out at MichelobUltra.com/courtside. Michelob Ultra Superior Access, Courtside 24-25 sweepstakes, no purchase necessary. Open to U.S. residents 21 and up. Begins on October 1st, 2024, ends July 1st, 2025. Multiple entry periods. Visit MichelobUltra.com/courtside for free entry deadlines, and official rules. Message and data rates may apply. Void where prohibited.
You know what's smart? Enjoying a fresh gourmet meal at home that you didn't have to cook. Meet Factor, your loophole in the laws of mealtime. Chef-crafted meals delivered with a tap, ready in just 2 minutes. You know what's even smarter? Treating yourself without cheating your goals. Factor is dietitian approved, chef prepared, and you plated. Pretty smart, huh? Refresh your routine and eat smart with Factor. Learn more at factormeals.com.
Welcome back to Generals and Napoleon. We have the eminent, brilliant, wonderful, fantastic amount of superlatives, but there's many more. Graeme Callister. Hello, Graeme.
Hi, how are you?
Good to see you. Graeme's been on our program before. He's definitely one of my favorite guests. Just very cool speaking voice, knows everything about the Napoleonic world. And he also has a book out that I highly recommend to all listeners. It's called Attack of First Corps. And that's a discussion of Durland's advance at Waterloo, correct, Graeme?
Yeah, Waterloo, the attack of First Corps, and it's about that first attack at the start of the day at Waterloo by Durland's, First Corps. About 20,000 men trying to smash through Wellington's left wing. And this book kind of unfolds the background to it, what happens in the attack, and, spoiler alert, how the Allies managed to see it off.
Yeah, I don't spoil it for anybody, but Napoleon loses Waterloo, so I guess it didn't go all that well. But it's a good book, and Durland, interesting guy, and his corps is an interesting part of the whole battle, so I highly recommend that. And there's another thing I'd like to discuss, because my good friend Graeme has just been made chairperson of the NRWGC, which is a charity I belong to and very much believe in. And in case anyone doesn't know, Graeme, what is that charity all about?
Yeah, so the NRWGC is the Napoleonic and Revolutionary War Graves charity. And we're a charity that basically looks to either reinter veterans that are found or preserve the graves of those who died in the period 1775 to 1815, or who served in the period 1775 to 1815, and who subsequently died. So we're a charity that looks to preserve their memory through the cleaning, the preservation, and the repair of gravestones, of monuments, but also the reinterment of any soldiers who are found in archaeological surveys. So if anyone's interested in the charity, you can find us if you just Google Napoleonic and Revolutionary War Graves Charity. You can find us online. Please do check out our website, and if it's something you're interested in, please do support the charity. We're a wonderful, welcoming group, and we'd love your support.
Yeah, it's a charity I very much believe in, and what drew me to it, and it's only £25 a year to join, British pounds, so it's very affordable. But if you think about all the veterans of foreign wars who are buried properly, whether it's World War II, World War I, Civil War, beyond that, like if you go Napoleonic Wars or even Revolutionary War, there's a great number of graves that have gone into disrepair or have no marker at all, right, Graeme?
Yeah, absolutely. And in Britain, we have the Commonwealth War Graves Commission that look after graves from the First World War onwards, but we don't have anyone looking after these graves from 200 years ago. And the charity's ethos is that military service is the same whatever era you're in. Men were willing to make that sacrifice, they were willing to fight, and whether they died during the combat or whether they survived the wars, we think that their graves should be treated with respect. And therefore we raise money, we do cleaning projects to make sure that these graves can be accessed by people and can become sites of memory for these veterans.
Yeah, again, their website is really cool. They have calendars, different promotional items you can buy to support the charity, and I highly recommend it. Okay, to the subject matter of today's podcast, we're going to discuss the battles of probably Napoleon's best independent commander, with apologies to Marshal Davout. Who are we discussing today, Graeme?
We're looking at the battles of Marshal Lannes, Marshal Jean Lannes. Maybe not always put up there as Napoleon's best commander. We can discuss why that is later on. But a fascinating character who, as you say, probably is one of, if not the best independent commander in Napoleon's army.
Yeah, I agree. We're going to do a quick background on Lannes because we're going to discuss more of his battles. If you want a biography of Lannes, I did an episode on that a while ago, and you can check that out. But he came from a simple background. He's not well educated, but picks up quickly on military life. And early on, he meets a good mentor, the future General Pouzet. And it's interesting how mentors affect our life choices. How does this drill instructor, you think, affect his life?
Yeah, as you say, Lannes is not meant to go into the military. He's the son of a kind of tradesman, essentially, who has a bit of land and a townhouse. He's one of 5 sons and a daughter, so he's actually meant to go into the dyeing business, as in becoming an apprentice dyer. But when the Revolutionary War breaks out, he joins the army. Bit of uncertainty as to whether he joins and then leaves and then joins again a couple of months later. But in any case, he becomes a sous-lieutenant, a sub-lieutenant in the army in 1792. And his battalion is sent off to be trained. And one of the men training it is a regular army officer called Lieutenant Pouzet. And he'd been in the Champagne regiment in the old army. And Pouzet basically takes Lannes under his wing and shows him how to be a soldier. He teaches him the rudiments of tactics. He instructs him in military conduct. He explains how the army should work. And all of this for a man with Lannes who was not born to command. He was not born to be an officer. This is absolutely valuable to teaching Lannes the military arts, but also how to command men. And Pouzet and Lannes become very close friends. As we'll see, soon shoots up the ranks, but he never forgets his old friend. He always looks out for him, he puts in a good word, and he really values Pouzet's sense, his military understanding, and his guidance and friendship over the years to come.
Yeah, it's just really interesting to have a good mentor and kind of show you what you can be, because he was a bit of a hellraiser in the town he grew up in, so it must have been shocking to the townspeople to see him come back as Marshal one day.
Yeah, and we see this a lot from Napoleonic memoirs with mentors being so important. So someone like Marbot, who will actually go on to be a staff officer of Lannes. Marbot joins the Hussars as a private soldier, and he has a mentor that really puts him on the straight and narrow. Marbot's a hellraiser as well, but this mentor helps him through the first months of his service. We see it with d'Erlon, the man I wrote the book about, famous from Waterloo, but also from Mayer in the Peninsula. He and actually Marshal Soult are both mentored for a year or two by the future Marshal Lefebvre, who really brings along their careers and really gives them the scope to develop as officers. So I think having a mentor is so crucial to a lot of these guys in the early Napoleonic or the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars.
Agreed. And Marshal Lannes about to meet, the future Marshal Lannes about to meet probably his best mentor. He meets Napoleon in Italy during the famous Italian campaigns of 1796, 1797. I think Lannes, he makes his mark there. How does he perform in Italy?
Yeah, as you say, this is really where he does make his name, partly because he's under the arch propagandist Napoleon, who is very good at telling the world what everyone has done, but also clearly he stands out as an officer who is highly capable. He goes into that campaign basically as a colonel without a job. So he'd been a colonel, but his regiment had been amalgamated, so he'd lost his command. And he's meant to be discharged from the army, but Napoleon insists, having heard his reputation, that he keeps Lannes in the army. And within 2 weeks, Lannes really proves that to be a good decision. So at Dago, which is only 5 days into the campaign, it's Lannes who leads the counterattack that ejects the Austrians from the village at the point of the bayonet, showing enormous courage but also great leadership. And that gets him picked out by Napoleon for special praise. He's then given command of 3 elite battalions of grenadiers. So at this time, grenadier companies were taken from their normal battalion and grouped together. And he's given command of 3 of these elite grenadier battalions, and he becomes basically the leader of the army's advance guard. And that is pretty much what he does, 1796 to 7. He's the man who leads the most daring attacks, who storms the most difficult positions, and he does it leading from the front. He's adored by the men under his command, he's respected by the army, and he really builds his reputation. But it's not just courage. It's not just charging head on to things. He is quite an adept military man. He shows himself to be a good understander of terrain and timing as well. And he just has a litany of kind of great moments in Italy. He's the first one who crosses the Po. He's instrumental at capturing the bridge at Lodi. Napoleon actually says he's the first man to set foot on the far bank of the Adda, the river that they're trying to get across. He performs well in a counterinsurgency operation in North Italy, and he also very crucially spends a lot of time escorting Napoleon around on scouting missions, and the two seem to have become pretty friendly. It's probably at Bassano that he makes his reputation beyond the army of Italy a bit more, because he personally captures two enemy standards. He's absolutely at the forefront, and Napoleon writes to the Directory in Paris asking them to promote him to General of Brigade. So he kind of makes his name beyond the army at Bassano. He actually gets wounded just after that, but even that allows him to cover himself in glory, because the Austrians then launch a counterattack, and Lannes famously gets up from his hospital bed, goes back to the army to fight at Arcola, quickly gets wounded again and is dragged off to a field hospital. But on hearing that the battle is going badly, leaves the field hospital, returns to the front, and then is the one that leads the capture of the infamous bridge at Arcola, where he actually gets another wound. So, he's a man who shows great heroism, great leadership. He wins huge plaudits within the army, but also gets noticed beyond it as well. People are noticing not just his courage, but also his tactical acumen in actually pulling off some of these assaults against great odds. It's not just about charging the cannon. He's got a bit of cleverness to it as well.
Indeed, yeah. I've seen criticism that they're mostly elitist, that Napoleon's marshals were just trumped up sergeant majors. But, I mean, these guys beat the best armies in Europe for 15 years. So I think a lot of them, especially Massena, Davout, and Lannes, had good tactical ability.
Yeah, absolutely. And that instruction as a young man probably really helped Lannes in that regard. Davout, of course, had been an officer of the Ancien regime, and so had been given some instruction himself. But these men have real tactical acumen. They're not just guys that shout and lead a charge. They will do that, but also they know what they're doing tactically, and they have enormous bravery as a commander as well, not just leading from the front, but in committing their troops, in knowing when to leave a reserve and when actually to go all in. These guys know what they're doing militarily, which is why they have such great success.
There's an example coming up here that I think it shows Lannes' bravery and ingenuity. After Napoleon's success in northern Italy, he sends General Victor and Lannes to invade the Papal States, and he has a famous incident there with the Papal troops. Can you give us the details on that?
Yeah, this is a brilliant story, a really intriguing one that shows the measure of the future Marshal Lannes. And this is reported by Marmont in his memoirs. And the story goes that Lannes, with 2 or 3 officers and 8 or 10 orderlies, is scouting ahead of the advance guard of his army as they're invading the Papal States. And he turns a corner on a road and comes face to face with a squadron of about 300 Papal horsemen. And the commander of the Papal cavalry immediately orders his men to draw their sabres. Now, Lannes is outnumbered about 20 to 1, which is long odds even for him. So rather than attacking, he decides, no, he'll take a different approach. And according to Marmont, Lannes basically rides up to the commander of this cavalry squadron and in a high and haughty tone says to him, "By what right, sir, do you draw your sabres? Sheathe them at once." And now usually you don't take orders from an enemy general, but this Papal commander is totally taken aback and he says, "Oh, yes, sir," and orders the sabres to be sheathed. No, Lannes thinks this is brilliant, tries again, and says, "Dismount and lead your horses to my headquarters." And this crestfallen officer, "Yes, sir," complies, orders his men off their horses to walk into captivity. And so here's Lannes with a dozen men with him, capturing a squadron of 300 cavalrymen by sheer bravado and force of personality. Although, as he later told Marmont, when they laughed about it that evening, if he'd have tried to run away, the cavalry would have probably chased him down or shot him with their carbines. So the best thing to do, really, was to try a bit of what he called impudence and audacity. And it clearly worked. And, it is a great story, and it really shows the measure of Lannes as a man.
Yeah, if you go dashing off and there's 300 people chasing you, you would have been killed. Yeah, try a bit of cheek for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
After that, he accompanies Napoleon in his 1798 conquest of Egypt. And he begins to earn the, I guess I would call it, ire of other Napoleonic devotees like Murat and Bessières. Why did these men despise each other? I mean, they're all talented. Was it just competition for Napoleon's attention?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly a big part of it. Now, these are men who'd risen very rapidly in rank. They've got reputations to maintain, and they don't like other people taking a part of the glory. They're all happy for Napoleon to be the main man, but they want to be the next one in his footsteps. But also I think that there's little things that go on that irritate each other, that kind of spill over. Lannes gets really annoyed at the Battle of Aboukir when his infantry division's pretty important in winning the battle, but it's Murat and the cavalry charge that get all of the glory and the attention, and Napoleon's praise all goes to them. Lannes gets wounded immediately after the battle, spends some time in hospital, so he doesn't even get the glory of capturing the fortress of Aboukir, even though his division is the one that captures it. He also ends up in the hospital bed next to Murat, and I suspect that really irritated him, and they just end up sniping at each other because they're both irritable people. Lannes' boorish behaviour at this point might be forgiven, though, because he just found out that his wife had given birth to a son. Normally a happy occasion, but in this case he hadn't actually seen her for 14 months before she gave birth. And he might have lacked education, but even he can count past 9 and realises that, 14 months after seeing your wife is not ideal when she gives birth. So he's understandably in a bad mood. Things also spill over a bit, though, when they get back to France. Murat and Lannes actually both wanted to court Napoleon's sister Caroline, both wanted to marry her, and originally Caroline favours Lannes, but strong influences in the Bonaparte inner circle, which included Béziers, who's a good friend of the family, persuaded her to choose Murat. And so Lannes develops a pretty significant dislike for them. And then over the next few years, there's a bit more sniping at each other and a few things we can go into later. But it's also, a personality clash there. Murat is flashy, cocky, not that intelligent as a soldier. Many other people fall out with him. Davout and Ney, amongst others, think that Murat is over-promoted and pretty modest in his talents. Béziers, of course, was Murat's friend. So all of that kind of comes together, I think, and ends up with Lannes and Murat having a pretty strong mutual dislike, by the time the Empire comes in.
Yeah, and I think Lannes dodged a bullet by not marrying Caroline Bonaparte, so good. That probably worked out best for him.
Yeah, absolutely.
But carrying on with the conquest of Egypt, Napoleon makes his way up to Acre, where there's an unsuccessful siege, which he ultimately has to retreat from or go back to Cairo from. However, Lannes is grievously injured here. What happens at the siege for Lannes?
So, this is an incident that shows Lannes' courage, but more importantly, his men's devotion. So the story is that Lannes is leading one of the assaults on Acre when he gets shot in the neck, or the back of the head and the neck, and gets knocked unconscious. And the attack fails, it falls back, but his men know that if he's left there, he's almost certainly going to die, either from the wound or, once the besieged force starts to kind of come out to pick up their wounded, they'll probably slit his throat. So a small group of grenadiers led by a captain dashes forward under heavy fire to try to retrieve him. All of the grenadiers are shot down apart from the captain, who grabs hold of Lannes, manages to drag him back to safety, rescue him. And Lannes never forgot the man's actions, and would later, I think, set him up with an inn or something similar and go and visit him.
Yep.
So Lannes was very grateful. But Lannes is badly wounded by this. He's operated on by Larry, the Surgeon General at the time, and they managed to get the bullet out, but it leaves Lannes with a kink in his neck for the rest of his life. So he holds his head at an angle forevermore after this, for the rest of his life. And he also has slight difficulty in speaking. It damages his vocal cords slightly. So this is a nasty wound that he receives at Acre that kind of literally scars him for life.
Yeah, he sounds real close to death right there. So he was lucky to get out. And I think I did read that. He set the captain up who saved him for life and made sure he was taken care of. But yeah, he returns to France with Napoleon. He's one of the sacred few that returned. And he assists Napoleon in his coup for power and is later assigned as ambassador to Portugal by Napoleon in 1801. Even though this isn't a battle per se, opinions are mixed on his performance. How did he do in his role as ambassador?
He's not a diplomat, so it is a mixed performance. The embassy to Portugal's kind of a bit of a punishment and an exile for Lannes. So he'd fallen out of favour by spending too much money on the consular guard. And when I say too much, it's 300,000 francs he overspends by. And when Napoleon finds out, he is furious and orders him to repay it or be court-martialed. Lannes couldn't repay, but General Augereau, who was an old friend of Lannes and an inveterate looter, he'd stolen an absolute fortune in Italy. Augereau just steps in, gives him the 300,000 francs and lets him repay it. So Lannes is able to avoid a court-martial and disgrace, and Napoleon knows he needs to send him away from Paris to show some disfavour. Other people will say he was being favoured by going to Portugal because he could make some money there, but in any case, he's sent off to Portugal, where he quickly falls out with the Portuguese chief minister. He falls out with the diplomatic corps, and he basically threatens the Portuguese chief minister and says, look, if you don't stop being nicer to me, I'm going to leave and go back to Paris. And an ambassador leaving is always a sign that war will be declared. The minister calls his bluff, Lannes storms off and goes back to France. And when he gets there, Napoleon's furious, because Napoleon doesn't want to go to war with Portugal. He wants neutrality. So Napoleon basically shouts at Lannes and tells him off for what he's done and says, right, get back to Portugal. Napoleon kind of backs him, though, by demanding the sacking of this Portuguese minister, which the Portuguese government does. And Lannes is sent back a second time to Portugal. And this time he's much more successful. He wins over the regent and the Portuguese nobility a bit. He's helped by his wife in this, who is, she's young, pretty. She's very good at the social skills that maybe he lacks.
The new wife, not the pregnant one from the Egyptian.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. He had remarried by this stage. So the less than faithful wife that had given birth during the Egyptian campaign was divorced. He's remarried. He has a new wife who really helps him in this diplomatic endeavour. And in the end, he gets what he wants. No, Portugal remains neutral in the conflict, and Lannes comes home with rather a lot of money. Some of it is gifts from the Portuguese regent. Apparently, he handed over a fortune in diamonds to Lannes as a mark of affection. But also, Lannes took advantage of a tradition in Portugal, or a custom in Portugal, where ambassadors could sign basically to allow a ship to import things without customs inspection. And normally an ambassador would do that with one or two, kind of, like a diplomatic package, essentially. He'd do it with one or two ships. Lannes decided basically to sell this ability to a merchant for a huge sum of money. And this merchant obviously started signing these things for everyone. The Portuguese government get wind of this and realized every ship is coming in with Lannes' signature on. They complain. He gets recalled by Napoleon. But, he got his mission done. He got Portuguese neutrality. And when he comes back, he's actually so rich from all of this shenanigans, he's able to repay Augereau that 300,000 francs he'd borrowed. So Lannes actually comes out of this embassy quite well. But it's quite telling he's not ever considered for another diplomatic mission again.
Right. And, it's easy to say, well, he shouldn't have done that. But most of these marshals were inveterate looters. So, it's...
Yeah, and it was a Portuguese custom that they allowed you to do it, and other people have been abusing it for years. It's just he may have taken it to a new level.
Yeah, I always wanted to ask you about that. But moving on, I kind of missed one thing. I forgot about his critical victory at Montebello. Napoleon's campaign against the Austrians in 1800, Napoleon wins at Marengo. He's in the vanguard of Napoleon's force for the Marengo campaign. He's over the Alps and wins a critical victory at Montebello. How did he do that?
So essentially, Lannes is ordered by Napoleon to be the advance guard and to advance his corps towards the enemy and basically attack anything in his path, because Napoleon thinks there's very little of the enemy ahead of him. And sticking to the letter of his orders, on the 9th of June, Lannes bumps into an enemy force and launches his advanced units into an attack. And so it starts a clash between a couple of regiments, but then both commanders on both sides feed in more and more troops. And Lannes only has 4 regiments with him, and it turns out he's up against 26 battalions of Austrians. Now, he basically decides to take the offensive. Thinks that aggression is the way forward, so he tries to turn the Austrian flank. He attacks the heights and the village of Castigio in the centre and the left, and he puts the Austrians on the back foot by attacking them, but he's massively outnumbered. He does take the village, but of course the Austrians have reserves and counterattack and retake it, and at that stage, given their numerical advantage, they expect Lannes going to withdraw. But instead, he attacks again, and he draws the Austrians into basically repeated attacks and counterattacks around this village and around the heights, and pins them in place. But after a few hours back and forth, his small force is starting to look pretty thin, and especially the very small amount of cavalry he's got with him, who've had to charge repeatedly to ward off Austrian dragoons. But he's basically pinned down and worn down an Austrian force probably double his size. And of course Lannes knows that he's the advance guard. There are men coming behind him. And when General Victor's corps starts to arrive in the early afternoon, the Austrians haven't got much left to resist them. And it is Victor who manages to push the Austrians from the field with his attack, so it's not quite a victory for Lannes alone. But basically, his tactical sense, his aggression perhaps, but also his use of terrain, his ability to inspire men, which basically, pin and wear down this Austrian force twice his size, allowing some French troops to come in behind and win the day. So it is a great victory, really, for Lannes at Montebello. And of course, that's where his title, the Duke of Montebello, will later come from.
Yeah, it was a violent clash. I remember there was a quote about bones cracking like windows in a hailstorm because there was such a hail of musketry and cannonballs from the Austrians. So it was a pretty rough battle for Lannes.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one where he really shows his personal courage as well as his ability to inspire his men.
Moving on to Austerlitz a few years later, Lannes is in charge of the northern flank of this famous battle and performs well. But his performance is kind of outshined by Davout and Soult. And he and his corps isn't prominently featured in the bulletins of the battle afterwards. And he leaves the army in a huff. What is Napoleon's reaction to this? Because, Napoleon probably won his most famous battle ever, and one of his bravest paladins just up and leaves.
Yeah, I mean, Napoleon actually did give permission to Lannes to leave the army, and I think Lannes probably just about waited to receive that permission before he went off. I mean, the whole thing comes down to Lannes being a bit upset, as you said, at not getting the credit. He's on the far left or the far northern side of the French army during the battle. He and Murat actually worked well together for once, and they push back Bagration's force. They basically win a mini battle in their own right. But of course, the main battle is won elsewhere. Murat and Lannes capture 6,000 or 7,000 prisoners, 30 cannon. So, they've done really well. But compared to what Napoleon's done in the southern part of the battlefield, theirs is overshadowed. And when he doesn't get any of the credit, he falls out with Napoleon. I think they have a stand-up row. There aren't many records of exactly why they fall out, but Lannes, in any case, demands to leave the army. And on the 9th of December, so a week after the battle, Berthier writes to Lannes and says that Napoleon regrets deeply that Lannes wants to leave the army, but he accepts that he can go home if he wants, as long as he comes back if war breaks out again. So Napoleon, I think, basically decides Lannes needs to go off, cool down, and come back when he's ready. I think Napoleon regrets that one of his friends has decided to leave the army, but it is interesting that Lannes goes home and literally goes back to the town of his birth and stays there for about 10 months, and Napoleon just leaves him to it, lets him cool off. But as soon as war is threatened again, Napoleon sends a letter to Lannes and says, please come back to the army now, we need you. And Lannes returns immediately. So I think there was no long-term falling out between the two after this. Napoleon still clearly understands his military merits.
It is amazing with these bulletins because there's the old saying that lie like a bulletin, and they are propaganda pieces. But how important it was to be mentioned in Napoleon's dispatches or bulletins to these generals and marshals, it was, or just the regular soldiers. It was like the best thing in the world to be mentioned in these bulletins. Correct?
Yeah, because you know that bulletin's being read out in churches, in town squares across France. It's being read out in the theatres. Everyone in France is going to see this bulletin. They're going to hear it. There's the theory that Napoleon's army is an army of honour. John Lynn's theory of the army of honour. And this is all about gaining honour. This is getting your name out there, being seen to be renowned. And to be ignored is almost to be chastised. You haven't done anything to gain renown, to gain honour. And so to be ignored in a bulletin, it really upsets some people, especially as Napoleon is quite fulsome in his praise quite often. But to be in a bulletin and to be there as the man who captured something or who did something, that's the highest honour.
Yeah, it's great to get the Légion d'honneur or a dukedom or a count title, but those you can only show off on your uniform and maybe to your friends. But like you said, the bulletins are mentioned throughout France and throughout Europe.
Yeah. Absolutely. Your name will be known across the continent as the great hero of a certain victory.
Yeah. Well, moving on to maybe Lannes' most famous victory. In 1806, like you said, Napoleon called him back for his campaign in Prussia. And Lannes excels in the opening battle of Saalfeld, which is still studied at the French War College to this day. Why is this particular battle so impressive?
So essentially, Lannes at Saalfeld is able to envelop and completely destroy an enemy force. It's not just that he wins a battle, takes some ground, but he basically annihilates the enemy in front of him. The battlefield of Saalfeld is in some broken country near the River Saale. Saalfeld, the town, is in kind of the southeast of the battlefield. So if you're looking on a map, it would be in the bottom right of the map. And the River Saal then runs to the east of the town, so to the right-hand side on the map of the town, and cuts diagonally up towards the north-northwest. And there's a Prussian-Saxon force arrayed on the west bank, so that the French side of the river, with its left wing on Saalfeld, and then its right extending further north to the northwest. There's a single bridge over the river at Saalfeld, which the Prussians could use to escape, or there's a road that runs parallel to the river off to the north that they could use to get out. So basically the Prussians are with their backs to the river without much of a way to escape, but they're there because they want to block the French advance. They want to stop them moving on that road to the north and stop them getting across the river. So Lannes decides he needs to remove them from blocking these two roads, and he needs to remove them entirely. So he brings up his force against them, and he uses the broken country to engage slowly. So he pushes out skirmishers and some artillery to pin the Prussian left, and then he swings Suchet's division basically round the Prussian right to try to envelop them. He makes Prince Louis, the Prussian commander, think that the Prussian left is under more of a threat than it is, so Louis actually reinforces his left, whereas actually the main blow is going to come to the right. And Lannes manages essentially to maneuver the Prussians out of their positions. The Prussians can't really see what's happening because of the broken ground. And when the French appear, the Prussians and their Saxon allies are pretty quickly pushed out of their strong points. So he uses terrain exceptionally well. He takes advantage of the enemy's mistakes. Prince Louis makes mistakes with his dispositions, including not really protecting his right flank and reinforcing the left at the wrong time. He also takes advantage of the fact that Louis launches an attack against Lannes in the centre of the battlefield, which is quite easily defeated but leaves quite a gap. And after a few hours of combat, basically the Prussian Saxon forces have been pushed away from Saalfeld on the left, so uncovering that bridge. They've been cut off to their right, so to the north, and they're basically surrounded. At that point, Louis tries to recover the situation with a cavalry attack, launches in his hussars, but the two regiments of French hussars countercharge them, overwhelm the Prussian horsemen, and Prince Louis is killed in the general melee. The Prussian-Saxon line is therefore cut off from retreat either way. Their commander's been killed, and Lannes launches his final attack there, which just smashes them open. The remaining units basically are pinned against the river. Individuals try to escape by swimming the river, and many of them do get away. The river's not that deep or wide, but many others also surrender. A French cavalry is able to pursue. They go round the bridge and cut off some of these men who swum the river, but it's broken country on the far side as well. And that kind of broken country and the fall of night at the end of the battle allow many of these individuals to escape. So while not every single man in this Prussian-Saxon force is destroyed or captured, the force as a cohesive whole is completely annihilated in this battle, and its commander gets killed as well. So this really is held up as an example of how to use terrain, how to envelop an enemy, and how to annihilate an enemy force that's in a bad position.
Yeah, it's interesting tactic, but it's very Napoleonic-esque. Pin one flank down, wait till they move their reserves to that flank, and then when they do, hit them on the other flank. And it sounds like it worked to perfection in this battle.
Yeah, absolutely. I think by this stage, Lannes has been around Napoleon for a while. He's absorbed perhaps some of that, but he's an instinctively good commander himself. But it is absolutely classic textbook way of using terrain and of pinning the enemy to annihilate them, which I guess is why they still teach it today.
Yeah. Moving along to 1807, this next battle, it is Napoleon's victory at the end of the day, but I think it is Lannes' best performance, strategically using his mind, and he uses a defensive posture, which is interesting. It's not that aggressive. The Battle of Friedland, where he's outnumbered greatly against the Russians. What does he do here that you think is so unique and really allows Napoleon to win the day?
Well, if Saalfeld is Lannes pinning and annihilating an inferior enemy against the river, at Friedland he basically entices a superior enemy to attack him across a river, and then pins them against it, holds them in place, and lets Napoleon sweep in with the rest of the army to annihilate them. So the situation is that Bennigsen's Russian army is on the east bank of the River Aller. Napoleon's army is on the west, but Napoleon's army is all spread out. So only Lannes' corps of about 25,000 men is visible. So Bennigsen thinks he can cross the river with his army and destroy this isolated French corps. But Lannes knows that Napoleon's got another 50,000 men less than a day's march away. And he sends word to Napoleon to tell him that the Russians are near. And then he sets his men up to encourage the Russians to cross the river to attack him. And he fights a very fluid rearguard action, interspersing withdrawals, counterattacks, and this basically forces Bennigsen to march more and more men across the river and to commit more and more men to the battle against Lannes, until by the early afternoon on the 14th of June 1807, there's about 60,000 Russians across the river facing Lannes, and Lannes is pinning them in place. The Russians, the only way out is either to go through Lannes' corps or back across the few bridges and pontoons that are concentrated around the village of Friedland, which is fine if no one's attacking you, but as soon as there's any pressure on those, they're going to become choke points. So there's not really much of a means of retreat for this army. So Lannes lured the Russians into a trap. And through his skill, he keeps his corps completely intact. He gets the Russians to commit to attacking him, but doesn't get himself pinned in place. He basically manages to make it so that when Napoleon does turn up with reinforcements, the Russians are trapped, and they just have to form a giant defensive cordon, basically, against what is now a superior foe. Napoleon is able to then smash the Russian left while Lannes continues to pin their centre. He cuts the Russians off from the bridge. Mass artillery is used at short range to absolutely brutal effect with canister. The battle becomes pretty horrific, but basically the Russian army can be annihilated. As you say, it's not entirely Lannes' victory. Napoleon and Ney and the other commanders there really play their part, but Lannes is the one that makes this victory possible. He wouldn't have won it on his own, but it wouldn't have been fought without his skill in luring the enemy into a trap, essentially pinning them against an obstacle and allowing Napoleon to deal that critical blow to them.
Yeah, and I think it's a great example of the corps system. Napoleon wanted to have these basically mini armies called corps and have them only 24 hours away from each other. So if one got in trouble, they could hold out until the rest of the army showed up. And I think that's kind of what happened here.
Yeah, absolutely. 1806, he'd done it against the Prussians, the battalion carry system, 4 corps marching kind of a day apart, but so they could turn in any direction to find the enemy. 1807, even better, he gets Lannes to pin them in place while bringing his other army corps up. So the corps system worked really well in these two campaigns, 1806, 1807, both because it's a good system, but also the skill of the commanders.
Yeah, indeed. Well, a year later, in 1808, Lannes is back on the warpath with Napoleon, as his emperor has just gone into Spain for the invasion of Spain. And Lannes crushes the Spanish army at Tudela. How did Lannes win this battle when the Spanish were ready for him?
So Spanish armies in 1808 are maybe not as bad as sometimes people assume, but they were no match tactically or in experience or morale for the soldiers of the French army. And they're also poorly led, and that's especially the case, it seems, with Tudela. So about half the Spanish divisions weren't in the right place at the start of the battle. The forces were separated, the Spanish forces are separated too widely. So Lannes finds it quite easy to isolate different divisions and defeat them in detail in this battle. Maybe I've made it sound too simple there, as if he's just going through the motions. It takes a huge amount of skill to do what he did, but there are mistakes on the Spanish side. So essentially the battle is that he moves first against the enemy's right, pushes them back. He then hits their centre really hard with artillery. 2 of his divisions attack in the centre, carve open the Spanish lines. Lannes sees the opportunity and launches his cavalry through the gap, which they open further. They cut up the Spanish divisions in the centre. They attack the Spanish right from the rear. And basically he's destroyed the centre and right within a few hours of combat. On the left, General Lagrange's division routes the divisions opposite him. Lagrange is killed in the attack, but they basically destroy the Spanish left as well. So the Spanish army more or less disintegrates. Although they had been set up in defence, although they'd known they were coming, the Spanish generals had put them in a kind of false position. There was a lack of cooperation between different parts of the Spanish army, and Lannes takes massive advantage of that. Part of the Spanish army does escape because the bits that were too far away to support the others managed to march off the field. The Spanish army loses most of its artillery, about 3,000 prisoners. This is a major victory for Lannes. One of the criticisms of Lannes is often that he doesn't win independent battles. Well, this is a great example of a major independent battle that he wins emphatically. I think it's just sometimes ignored because the Spanish are seen as not as strong a foe as the Russians or the Austrians or the Prussians.
Yeah, I don't think this one gets enough publicity either. It is a good win for Lannes. And yeah, it just seems like he wins battle after battle. Case in point, in January 1809, he wins the siege of Zaragoza. This one's unique because other French marshals and generals had failed here. This is brutal urban warfare. How did Lannes secure a victory in this one?
So Zaragoza is an unusual siege because the French tried to take the city in the summer of 1808 and fail, and the local commanders strengthen the old medieval defences, but they know that the city basically can't hold out against modern artillery. So Palafox, the governor, orders the streets to be barricaded so that when the French, or if the French broke in, they would have to fight not just through the city walls, but through the entire city. So every single house, every single church, every single street basically becomes a fortification. Palafox has 30,000 soldiers and about 10,000 civilian volunteers in his garrison. And so the entire city, every single building in it becomes a fortification. And this is what Lannes has to take. His men duly breach the city walls in 3 places and they break in, but the defenders simply then retire to the inner defences. And what Lannes decides to do, rather than trying to storm this all at once, is be very methodical. Take the city block by block, street by street, allowing his artillery to do a lot of the work, destroying houses and whatever else was in the way, minimizing his own casualties while maximizing the enemy's. Nonetheless, this is brutal, bloody, and time-consuming fighting. His troops are basically grinding their way forward. They're not storming the city and taking it quickly at all. So it takes about a month to work their way through. Eventually, the French also make a 4th breach in the outer walls so they can threaten the city from the north. And at that point, 3/4 of the defenders are dead, wounded, or ill. They realize that they're surrounded and have pretty much no chance. And so the city eventually surrenders. But Lannes takes it basically trying to minimize his own casualties by methodically working his way through this block by block. In the end, in truth, there's not much of the city left to surrender. Zaragoza is more or less destroyed here. Over 50,000 Spaniards died in the siege, 60% of them civilians. About 10,000 French soldiers, over half to disease, died in the siege. And the French troops hated the experience, and Lannes, incidentally, hated it as well. But they were victorious in the end.
Yeah, and I'm sure if you could ask Lannes, it's probably his least favorite thing that he was part of, because you're right. I mean, they had to blow up each house after they took it house by house, block by block, and it was just a siege of destruction. So probably not his favorite victory.
No, and there's a couple of kind of stories around that as well that really show that he doesn't enjoy the experience in any way. With him kind of blowing up in frustration, saying, that this damn Napoleon's going to have us all killed, or get us all killed, things like that. So he clearly does not like the experience of that siege at all.
Yeah, he's a very courageous man, but I think he was worn out by that siege.
Yeah.
In 1809, though, he's again in the vanguard for the war against Austria. And I'd like to talk about another siege, the Siege of Ratisbon, which is one of his most famous episodes. Do you want to walk us through that one? Or I just think it shows his leadership and his bravery.
Yeah, absolutely. So Ratisbon comes at the end of the kind of action around Egmont, and the French need to capture this town, modern-day Regensburg. They need to capture it with its bridges intact. Lannes' men and Davout's men are approaching the city. There's, I think, 6 Austrian battalions inside or something defending, so it's not going to be easy. But Lannes sees an opportunity. He notices near one of the gates of the city that there's an old house that looks a bit wobbly. So he orders the artillery to fire at it, and the artillery collapses this house into the moat and the ditch of the city, and basically creates a bridge that his soldiers can get across. And having done that, he calls for volunteers and says he wants his grenadiers to storm it. 50 men volunteer, they go forward and they're mostly shot down. So he calls for more volunteers, another 50 men volunteer, and they're shot down. And a third time he calls for volunteers and no one steps forward. So Lannes, looking around, says, well, fine, I was a grenadier before I was a marshal, I'm still a grenadier, and he grabs a scaling ladder and starts moving towards the town on his own. His staff see this happen and think, we can't let a marshal storm a city on his own. So they run out after him and start basically wrestling him for the ladder. Marbot talks about it in his memoirs and says, They tell him, "Oh, you'd be dishonoring us if you let yourself get killed, and we weren't with you, and we weren't all killed first." And so you've got this picture of Marshal in full dress uniform with all of his orders and decorations on him, basically fighting with his staff for the honor of carrying a scaling ladder against this town. And that the troops behind are basically shamed by this, by seeing their marshal do this, and as one, they basically volunteer for this. And so Lannes says, "Well, off you go," and lets his staff lead this assault against the city. And they charge forward with the scaling ladders, followed by the grenadiers who've all volunteered, and they do get across. Lannes actually doesn't go as part of this storming, though. He then grabs another group of volunteers and charges against the city gate, where he leads them in person to smash the gate down with axes while the other men are scaling the walls. And so kind of a two-pronged attack, and they take this city by storm. So, this is partly theatre. This is Lannes in full dress uniform, grabbing a ladder, moving solo. It's partly theatre, isn't it?
Yeah, but he knew how to press the buttons of his soldiers, kind of like Napoleon did. Like, he knew how to fire them up. But you do wonder, like, if his staff hadn't gone and wrestled the ladder away, would he have just gone up there and done it himself? He's pretty brave. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think he meant to storm a city alone, but like you say, he knows how to press men's buttons, so he knows that they're going to follow him. He knows that men are going to be shamed into wanting to not be dishonoured by seeing their marshal do this on his own. I think he's a man with great common sense, Lannes. He's exceptionally brave, but he is a man of some common sense. He doesn't expose himself unnecessarily to fire. He's not like Ney, who likes to go into the vanguard and just have a charge from time to time. Lannes will lead from the front when necessary. At other times in other battles, he stays at the back when that's better. And I think in this case, he knew that this was going to encourage his men. I don't think he'd have thrown his life away for nothing. But it is part of the spectacle of being a marshal is to be seen, and at the crucial moment he is seen. It works. His staff officers are the ones who come first, perhaps, but it encourages the infantry to go and try again and take the city. It should also be mentioned in the aftermath of this, they get into the city, and the Austrians start falling back, but there's a huge convoy of wagons full of powder in the middle of the streets, and some of the buildings catch fire in the fighting. So you've got a situation where there's burning buildings either side of a street and a huge convoy of powder wagons in the middle of it. It's looking pretty bad. And Lannes, basically, through force of personality, the fact that he's there on the spot helps as well, but he orders the French and the Austrians to stop fighting and gets men of both sides to help evacuate these wagons out of the city to stop the entire thing blowing up. So another great presence of mind, a demonstration of leadership. Ratisbonne and the storming of it is one of his finest hours.
Yeah, I remember reading Marbeau's memoirs, and early in his career, he would put himself in harm's way. If his troops were under a cannonade, he'd put himself there. And I think one of his mentors said, "Look, this is a war. You're always going to be in harm's way. Don't unnecessarily put yourself in harm's way." And Marbeau learned that, all right, well, my job as a general is to kind of be farther back, not necessarily be under a hailstorm of cannon. I think Lannes knew when to get out of range and when to lead the charge for the most part. I think Oudinot and Ney, just like you said, just charged because they like being in harm's way. But he did have some common sense, and I think this is a good example of it. I think he just wanted to push buttons in this case, like a coach of a football team or a soccer team. Like, how do I rev these guys up? Yeah.
You need to know how to get men to perform, and the way to do it there was to put himself in harm's way, so he did. But as was seen by the fact that the first two times he asked for volunteers and didn't go himself, he had no intention of having to be the first man over that ditch. It was only when all else failed that he thought this is the only way, and credit to him, it worked.
Yeah. Well, moving on to his final battle later that year, the Battle of Aspern-Essling outside of Vienna. He and his corps are isolated along with Massena's corps and Bessier's cavalry corps after the bridges are smashed, preventing reinforcement. How did he perform against this onslaught of the Austrian army?
Lannes' corps do pretty well on this day. This French army he's fighting with now it's not the formation of 1805-7 by this stage. They're not the veterans and the well-trained men of that army. They've had casualties, redeployments to Spain, discharges, and so many of these men are conscripts or relatively inexperienced. They don't have that staying power of earlier battles. And they are also surprised by the ferocity of the Austrians in this, who many people mention fought harder than they had probably in previous clashes. But Lannes and his corps do well. A division holds on to Essling all day against pretty heavy assaults. There isn't a huge amount of manoeuvre or finesse here. This is about staying power. But Lannes encourages his men. He deploys them well enough to hold on. He puts in reinforcements when necessary. He holds the line.
Yeah, he does, and performs well because Napoleon can't resupply, and they're heavily outnumbered. And after the first night of the battle, basically the two armies sleep within pistol shot of each other. He gets into an argument with Marshal Bessier, where the two almost draw swords on each other. What is this drama about?
So we remember, Marshal Bessier is an enemy of Lannes almost from earlier. Bezier and Murat are good friends. Lannes hates Murat, so Bezier doesn't get on with Lannes. So already they don't like each other. And during the first day of the battle, Napoleon has basically put Bezier under Lannes' command. He's given Lannes command of the right and the centre of the French forces. But Napoleon's phrasing of it is quite polite. He tells Bezier that he should follow the opinions of Marshal Lannes, which is a polite way of saying you're under his orders, but you don't want to make one marshal subordinate to another. But during the day, right, Lannes apparently feels the cavalry aren't being used particularly effectively. He thinks Bezier's being a bit conservative. And so he sends 4 successive messages to Bezier saying you need to charge home properly. I suspect this is quite deliberate. Even if the cavalry was being used well, Lannes was probably trying to wind Bezier up. But in the 4th message, he has his aide-de-camp Marbot use the exact words, "You are ordered to charge home," which in the context of, a Napoleonic kind of opinion being expressed between men of equal rank, that's pretty blunt. And the idea, you're ordered to charge home, one, it's insulting because you're under someone's orders, but 2, it implies that so far you haven't been charging home properly, which is quite offensive to a cavalryman. And the next charge that happens after that is carried out to brilliant effect. It does severe damage to the Austrian centre. General d'Espagne is killed at its head, but nonetheless Lannes' order seems to have been correct. But Bezier took offence at this, and I suspect he was absolutely meant to take offence because Lannes thought he was a repulsive weasel and really didn't like him. But that evening, the men bump into each other at Massena's headquarters. Hot words are exchanged, Bezier basically saying he's been insulted, Lannes basically saying, well, you should be insulted. Lannes saying, if I'd been put under your command, I'd have resigned. Saying, well, but Napoleon has put you under my command, so you need to do what you're ordered and not just parade around in front of the enemy without any effect. So, Lannes is deliberately insulting Bezier, and Bezier understands this as an insult and demands satisfaction. Lannes offers it on the spot. The two of them grab their sword hilts as if they're about to fight a duel, but then Massena steps in. He is the senior marshal, and he basically chastises both of them and orders them in the name of the emperor to keep their swords sheathed and to disperse. Bezier then goes off in a huff. Lannes goes off to complain to Napoleon that Bezier isn't following orders, and Napoleon sides with Lannes in this case. But I think this drama is basically about two personalities that don't like each other, and Lannes took the opportunity to needle Bezier, and Bezier took the bait. But it could have looked serious, though. Two marshals hacking at each other with swords when the enemy is only a pistol shot away wouldn't have been a good look for the army.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Yeah, and was Bessier malingering all day, as Lannes said? Who knows? But like you mentioned, once the charge was executed home, it went well. And I believe Lannes said, he was telling his aide, see, if I hadn't sent that message, he would have dithered all day, and I made the right call. So, yeah, it's kind of hard to figure that one out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, the next day doesn't go very well. The Battle of Aspern-Essling, it heats up again very quickly. And at the end of the second day of the battle, he's talking with his old friend, General Pouzet. What happens at that moment?
Yeah, so, this is, the end of another day of brutally hard fighting, but this time it is clear that the French are going to have to pull back and regroup, that this battle is going to be lost. Austrian artillery is now smashing into the French lines. No reinforcement is going to be coming across the river. This is brutally hard fighting. And General Pouget, who we remember as Lannes' mentor from 1792, they've been firm friends since, still looks up to him, has been helping his career. They're talking together when a cannonball flies over, hits Pouget, and kills him on the spot. Now, Lannes has been a soldier for a long time, but even for him, the brutal loss of a friend as he was speaking to them seems to be a pretty traumatic moment. Lannes had also seen the same happen with another old friend, General Savoni, at Eckmühl only a month before when he'd been talking to him. So, the loss of this friend really hits Lannes hard. And he needs to take a moment to compose himself. An eyewitness has said that, essentially he goes a short distance away and sits on the edge of a ditch where, he basically he starts weeping for the loss of his friend. But while he's sitting there with his legs crossed over, kind of one knee on top of the other, a 3-pounder cannonball flies across the field, ricochets and smashes into his legs where they're crossed over. One kneecap is totally smashed. The back of the other knee is torn to pieces. His legs are basically destroyed. He tries to stand, but obviously can't, and he has to be carried from the field in immense pain. They didn't have any stretchers with them. There's no field ambulances there. And the only blanket they could find to use as a stretcher was the one that was already covering Lannes' old friend Pouget, and Lannes refuses to use that. He doesn't want to be carried from the field in this blanket covered in his blood, his friend's blood. So he's carried to a field hospital just in men's arms. And Marbo says this caused immense pain to him with his 2 smashed legs. So the second day of Aspen Essling, alas, is the last battle of Marshal Lannes.
Yeah, I know he's wounded and eventually dies, not immediately, but over a period of time. And Napoleon loses one of his best, I guess, fire eater generals that he could put anywhere in the empire. He's famously replaced by Oudinot, Marmont, and MacDonald, who the army calls Lannes' small change. What do you think his legacy is as a general, and what did his loss mean to Napoleon?
I think he was a massive loss for Napoleon, personally as well as professionally. Lannes' death is one of the few times that Napoleon wept at the loss of a friend, and showed that kind of human emotion. But Lannes was also clearly a very talented general. He excelled at reading terrain, at deploying troops. He seemed to have a real knack for timing. His commands consistently performed excellently in both attack and defense. He was neither just a rearguard general nor just a vanguard general. He was courageous to a fault, as we've said, but he also knew when not to expose himself to fire. He could motivate men. He was adored by his troops. This is a man who consistently got the job done for Napoleon. He has a consistent track record of success, of semi-independent command, and it's quite telling that Napoleon relatively frequently actually put other marshals and senior generals under Lannes' command. By the time we get to 1809, Lannes is very much in that top tier of marshals who he would give an army command to. Had he lived, he may well have been sent back to command in Portugal, for example. If there is one gap in his CV, it's that, people normally point to the lack of independent command, but he does win at Saalfeld. He wins at Tudela without any assistance. He performs brilliantly at Friedland against an entire Russian army, even though he knows reinforcements are coming. So Napoleon has enormous faith in Lannes, and the loss of a general of that talent is a huge blow. But that faith also, though, comes from friendship, because the two men were close friends, and that was something really valuable that Napoleon lost in 1809. Lannes was a friend to the end. He was never cowed by Napoleon. He always called him the informal tu instead of vous. He was always also willing to offer a friend's advice. Blunt, sometimes unwelcome, but always well-meaning. He didn't always agree with Napoleon, and Napoleon didn't always listen to him, but he knew that Lannes would tell him the truth. He would tell him what he thought. He is not always considered one of the greatest marshals because he doesn't have that independent command, but if he lacks the victories of Massena at Zurich or Davout at Auerstadt, he also doesn't suffer their defeats like Massena in Portugal, or, I guess, whisper it quietly, but Davout on the retreat from Russia.
Yep.
And I'd say his legacy is one of a supremely talented commander and a valuable friend to Napoleon, albeit, we have to admit, one whose legacy is assured by his tragic end, very much at the height of his fame, at the height of his talents, and indeed at the height of the empire.
Yeah, you wonder if he had stayed alive throughout the empire, if he was in Russia with Napoleon, or defense of France in 1814, or even at Waterloo. things might have gone differently for Napoleon. And like you said, to have that frank person tell you, like, all right, it's time to make peace, or all right, you shouldn't invade Russia. To have someone you trust tell you those things, to no longer be at your side, was probably difficult for Napoleon.
Yeah, and you do wonder, would Russia have even happened? Would Lannes have been able to be the one to say to Napoleon, "Are you nuts? No, this is stupid." So it's a lot of what ifs, but I suspect had he lived, Lannes would have played an enormous role in the next few years of the empire.
Yeah. I mean, where Napoleon went on campaign, Lannes was usually right there, and I know he was duly missed. Yeah. Well, Graeme, that was amazing, my friend, as always. Thank you for that summation of the battles of Marshal Lannes. And again, if you have the opportunity, Graeme has a number of books on Amazon. I've read a few. They're very good. Waterloo Attack at First Corps is his newest, and I highly recommend checking them out. Graeme, thank you, my friend.
Thank you very much for having me.